Okay, this is our lecture on vertebrate evolution. This is chapter 29. So just for the outline of the chapter, we'll first talk about the chordates and chordates in general. So all vertebrates are chordates. However, there are also a couple of non-vertebrate chordates. So we have to talk about those guys first. For our last chapter, we talked about the invertebrates. We sort of ended up talking about echinoderms. And remember that echinoderms were deuterostomes. So echinoderms are deuterostomes, and then every single other vertebrate and also, or every single other chordate is also a deuterostome as well. Remember we talked about protostomes versus deuterostomes. All right, so we will talk about the chordates, the vertebrates in general. We'll talk about the fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and then mammals. Okay, so as we saw with all of our other chapters that we've done sort of recently, we're always looking at these phylogenetic trees, right? And so remember again, wherever you see these arrows indicates a derived trait, right? That's going to basically set this, branch apart from what was present before, right? So if you look here, you see this ancestral chordate. Every chordate has a notochord, right? And if you follow down along here, you can see these guys are the chordates, right? So, but these are not vertebrates. So these are the non-vertebrate chordates. And then everyone else, because they have vertebrae or a vertebral column, are vertebrates. Okay, and you can also see this here. Okay, so we're going to talk about these different groups throughout this chapter. All right, so again, just to talk about the chordates first, and I will tell you, you guys are going to be responsible for all of these, characteristics. So for instance, these four main characteristics of chordates, you guys should know them. So the four main characteristics of chordates are a notochord, okay, which is a dorsal supporting rod located below the nerve cord. And so at some point during development, all chordates will have these, these characteristics. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's present in the adult, but at some stage in their life. Dorsal tubular nerve cord, which is protected by vertebrae. Anterior portion will become the brain in most chordates. And again, you're in the chordates, you're not going to see a vertebral column, but in the vertebrates, this tubular nerve cord would be protected by a vertebral column. Pharyngeal pouches, again, at some stage during development, and also a post-anal tail. All right, and so this is just showing you this. So again, these are things that are around, early on during development. So obviously this is showing you an embryo here. You can see these pharyngeal pouches, the dorsal tubular nerve cord, and the notochord here. Again, these are all sort of structures that are necessary for proper development of the nervous system. If you want to think about the notochord and the dorsal tubular nerve cord, and then also the presence of the post-anal tail. Okay. So let's talk about what examples there are of non-vertebrate chordates, okay? So again, the notochord will persist and it's never replaced by a vertebral column, right? So these animals do not have a spine. Again, if you're talking about vertebrates, they'll have a notochord during development, early on, and then it will eventually be replaced by a vertebral column, okay? And so that's what's going to set apart a non-vertebrate versus a vertebrate. Okay, so our examples here, so lancelets, which are called cephalochordates. These are both marine animals. So they live in shallow marine environments. They're filter feeders. I'll show you a picture in a second. Also, sea squirts or urochordates are also non-vertebrate chordates. And so these guys have this thick outer covering called the tunic. Again, they're filter feeders. They exhibit bilateral symmetry. All right. And so these guys apparently are believed to be directly related to the vertebrates. All right, so if you look at a picture here, here's a lancelet. I mean, it almost kind of looks like a minnow or something like that, right? But you can see here, right, it has this, nerve cord and this notochord, right? But there is no vertebral column. And here's an example of a sea squirt. Maybe you've seen pictures of these guys before. They're filter feeders, remember, right? So basically this sort of in-current siphon is going to bring water in, and then this is where water is going to go out. And as the water flows through, they'll be able to capture their food. You can see kind of they still are going to have, obviously, well-developed organs, right? Okay, so those were our two examples of non-vertebrate chordates. Okay, now everything we're going to talk about are vertebrates. Okay, so most of the chordates are vertebrates. So if you're a vertebrate, again, you need to know these characteristics, right? So these vertebrates are going to share those other characteristics we talked about before of the chordates, but these are characteristics that are going to set the vertebrates apart, right? So vertebral column, hence the name, will replace that notochord, okay? And you'll see segmentation in that vertebral column. You'll also see a skull, okay, which will enclose and protect the brain. It also has this term again, encephalization, meaning you have this head region where obviously the skull is going to be and protects the brain, and also complex sense organs. Also an endoskeleton. Okay, so when we talked about, the arthropods, right? They have exoskeletons, and those are non-living. So a crab, right, a crustacean, or an insect will have to molt that exoskeleton. If we're talking about an endoskeleton, it's living tissue, right, that grows with the animal, protects internal organs, attaches muscle, and also if you have an endoskeleton, you start to see more often these paired appendages. Another characteristic of vertebrates is you see internal organs, okay? Large coelom, like I said, is a body cavity with a complete digestive tract. You have a closed circulatory system. I mean, if you think about our organs, right, this obviously all pertains to them. Respiratory system that has either gills or lungs, kidneys, right? And you also have separate sexes and sexual reproduction. All right. So this is just showing you, again, if you're a vertebrate, that notochord is going to be replaced by vertebrae, right? So this is showing you here, if you kind of looked at that developing embryo and you kind of just cut through like a cross section, you can see this neural tube. Again, this is all happening early on during embryonic development, right? You have this neural tube, which is basically going to form the brain and the spinal cord, okay? And then a notochord down here. This notochord essentially turns into the vertebral column, as you can see here, okay? And it starts to extend around the neural tube. And now you can see this neural tube has the vertebral column completely around it. Again, this is the spinal cord. Okay. So if we talk about when vertebrates came about and the descendants of vertebrates, right? So about 542 million years ago started the Cambrian period. At the end of the Ordovician period, you saw jawless and jawed fishes appear, okay? And so these are believed to be the earliest vertebrates, okay? So if you talk about jawed fishes, right, they have jaws, obviously, that's what it means. They are called gnathostomes, okay? Then you also have other types of fishes, have lungs and bony skeleton, and these guys are more adapted for land existence, okay? And you start to see some tetrapods here, okay? And so it's believed that these amphibians evolved from these bony fishes, right? So we're kind of talking, right? We're talking about how did we get, vertebrates in terms of the evolution of the vertebrates, which obviously there's some aquatic vertebrates and also some terrestrial. Talk about amniotes, right? They produce an amniotic egg, and we'll talk more about them in a little while. Okay, so like I said, these are kind of just some sort of key points in vertebrate evolution. All right, so the first group we're going to talk about is the fishes. Okay, so there's about 28,000 species that we know about. These are the largest group of vertebrates. Obviously, they're aquatic. They're gill-breathing vertebrates. There are some lungfish, which we mentioned in that last slide, and we kind of come back to some of that stuff on that last slide. So some of what's on this last slide, it kind of seems like a little out of place, I guess. But we'll come back to it and it'll make a little more sense. But it's kind of just pointing out ancestors to these vertebrates, okay? All right, so we said that the jawed fishes were called gnathostomes. If you're talking about jawless fishes, agnanthans, okay? And so the earliest vertebrate fossil of a jawless fish are these ostracoderms, okay? And so in terms of modern day jawless fishes, those are lampreys and hagfishes. I'll show you a picture in a second. And these guys, they lack a bony skeleton. These lamprey or these sea lamprey, I guess there's parasitic types as well, and they can actually affect fish population. So there was a case where these parasitic sea lamprey actually demolished a whole whitefish and trout population in the Great Lakes. All right, so I showed you a picture. So here, these guys are kind of nasty looking, right? So obviously you can kind of see if it's parasitic, right? It could just hook onto a fish and basically end up, you know, causing it to die. And so these are, again, what are these guys? Jawless fishes. This is an example of a lamprey, okay? And so, like I said, pretty nasty looking. All right, and if we're talking about fishes with jaws, those are gnathosomes, okay? And let's talk about some characteristics of jawed fishes. So, okay, there's not many species of these jawless fishes, right? And so it's really these lampreys and the hagfishes that are the modern day jawless fishes that exist, okay? So most of the fish that you know of are jawed fishes or gnathosomes. Okay, so again, here's some characteristics, right? So they exhibit ectothermy, or they're ectotherms. And what does that mean? They're cold-blooded. Okay, so dependent on the environment to regulate their body temperature. They do not have their own mechanisms to regulate body temperature like we do. They have gills. They can have cartilaginous or a bony endoskeleton, right? So a skeleton made out of cartilage or a skeleton made out of bone. They have scales. And again, this is so, I'm going to show you a picture in a second that describes or kind of shows where the jaws are believed to evolve from. So in those jawless fishes, those agnathans, it's believed that jaws evolved from this first pair of gill arches. Honestly, I'm not really going to ask you much about that. Okay, you also there's also another group here called placoderms, and you might have heard of this before. These guys are extinct. They were jawed fishes of the Devonian period, and they're thought to be ancestors of sharks and bony fish. Okay, so they don't exist today. And so that, like I said, this is showing the evolution of the jaw. Right, so it's showing you in these jawless fishes, this first gill arch is believed to become the jaws. All right, so if we talk about the cartilaginous fish first, okay, exactly as they say, they have a skeleton made of cartilage instead of bone. And these guys are going to be sharks, rays, skates. Okay, sharks, rays, and skates are all cartilaginous fishes. Here are some of the other characteristics of these guys. So they lack a gill cover. So you'll see that bony fishes have a gill cover. Cartilaginous fishes do not. They also have the ability to sense electrical currents in the water. So these electrical currents sort of generated by the movement of other animals, they're able to sense that. And so obviously they're really good predators because they have this sort of extra sense to be able to sense movement. Sharks and rays in particular use something called the lateral line system, and so they can actually sense pressure of an animal nearby. Again, they have this sort of keen sense of being able to detect another presence of an animal. Okay, they're filter feeders. Obviously, they're predators. And rays and skates, those pectoral fins are enlarged, right, to make these large wing-like fins. And then they're, sort of have these flattened bodies. Again, if you want to think of cartilaginous fishes, think of sharks, rays, and skates. So obviously, here's a picture of a shark. And here's a picture of a ray. Okay, and so you can see how flat they are. They're sort of fins, sort of enlarged. All right, bony fishes have a skeleton of bone, hence the name. About 25,000 species. Most of them within the bony fishes are called ray fin fishes. There is a small group, we'll say a little bit more about these guys. There's a small group of fishes called lobe fin fishes. And they have these fleshy kind of chubby fins, okay? Like I said, we'll talk a little bit, I'll say a little bit more about those lobe fin fishes in a second. These guys will lack external gill slits, and their gills are essentially covered, okay, by something called an operculum. They also have a swim bladder. So again, these are all characteristics of bony fishes. So which is a gas-filled flat sac in bony fishes. And it basically, if that pressure is altered within that swim bladder, it allows the fish to change its buoyancy and either go deeper or more, closer to the surface. A well-developed brain and nervous system, separate sexes, and most of these species undergo external fertilization, right? So the eggs are laid and fertilized externally. So here's some example of ray fin fishes, right? So again, these are fishes that you've seen many of these. Flying fish, a horseshoe, a seahorse is a ray fin fish, and this is just showing you kind of some of the basic anatomy. You guys aren't responsible for the anatomy of the fish. Said I was going to say a little bit more about these lobe fin fishes, and again, most of fish that you think about are ray fin fishes. These guys have these, like I said, these fleshy kind of chubby fins supported by bones, and it's believed that, so yes, there are some species of modern day lobe fin fishes, but it's also believed that these guys were sort of ancestors to amphibians. I'll show you a picture in a second. So these are the examples of the modern day lobe fin fishes, these lungfishes and these coelacanths. So these guys have lungs as well as gills, right? So you can see how they're able to, breathe outside the water and also in the water. And in these lobe fins, which are kind of fleshy and strong, it's believed that these sort of were ancestors, or they then were allowed or able to kind of walk on them, okay? So you can kind of see this sort of movement from the water to land, okay? So apparently in 1938, this coelacanth was actually caught. It was previously considered to be extinct, so they're still around. So this is showing you this guy here, right? So you can kind of see how they have these fleshy, kind of chubby fins that you could see potentially could be used, to sort of walk on. All right? So again, sort of, I don't know, not that it's a cross between terrestrial and aquatic, but a fish like this is believed to be an ancestor to an amphibian. He could perhaps walk a little bit on land and move to land, and then eventually you had the evolution towards amphibian. Which leads us to the amphibians. Okay, so again, characteristics of amphibians. They contain limbs, right? Fish obviously don't have limbs. Most of them are tetrapods. They have smooth and non-scaly skin, right, which is kept moist by these mucus glands. And if it's not moist, the amphibian's going to have a hard time surviving, okay? They have lungs, except they still depend on exchange of oxygen or absorption of oxygen and release of carbon dioxide through their skin as well, okay? And you guys did the dissection of this. You saw that they have pretty underdeveloped lungs. They have a double loop circulatory pathway and a 3-chambered heart. So if you talk about their circulatory system, sense organs are fine-tuned for life on land. They have a larger brain, more developed cortex. They are ectothermic, which means what? They're cold-blooded, okay? And aquatic reproduction, right? They're dependent on the water still because they lay their eggs in the water. Then you have the metamorphosis because you have a tadpole, then moving on to a frog. All right, and so you guys are responsible for being able to identify these different circulatory pathways. So we're showing here the fishes versus amphibians and most reptiles, and then this is some reptiles, but you can think of birds and mammals being here. Okay, so fishes, amphibians and reptiles, and birds and mammals. Okay, and so you can note, one second, let me just make sure. I feel like I skipped over something. No, I guess not. Right, so again, make sure you can identify these, right? So if I showed you these pictures, you should be able to say, no, I know this is a representative of a fish circulatory pathway, amphibian, and mammals. Okay, and so the purple indicates mixed blood. This is oxygen poor blood, the blue, and then oxygen rich blood. So you can see in the fish, right, that they only have one atrium and one ventricle, right? And the atrium is the receiving chamber, and the ventricle is the pumping chamber of the heart. So you can see this is, unoxygenated blood, okay, goes into the atrium, gets pumped out to the ventricle, goes to the capillaries in the gills. That's where it's going to pick up oxygen, right? Gets the oxygen, goes and delivers that oxygen to the rest of the body, and then comes back to the heart, okay? For amphibians, you can see that it goes to lung and skin capillaries, like I talked to you about, right? That's where it's going to get oxygen. And again, now you can see the unoxygenated blood, right, comes in through the right atrium here, okay, and it moves into this ventricle. Only one ventricle gets pumped out, okay, and you can see this sort of mixed blood here. So basically, you have blood coming from the lung and the skin capillaries that's oxygenated, mixing with this unoxygenated blood, right, and then it gets moved to the ventricle and pumped out throughout. Okay, here you notice that there is never any mixing of unoxygenated and oxygenating blood, okay, in the heart, right? You have 4 chambers. You have 2 receiving chambers here, right atrium and left atrium, and then you have 2 pumping chambers, okay? So again, we'll talk more about circulatory pathways and circulatory system in a couple chapters. Okay, so here's what I was kind of talking to you about with these lobed fin fishes and the sort of evolution of amphibians, right? So this is a hypothesis of tetrapod evolution, right? Moving again from being an aquatic animal that doesn't have any legs, right? Or, you know, any limbs, right? To an amphibian that has 4 limbs, okay? So these lobed fin fishes basically could potentially support themselves with those fleshy lobed fins, okay? It says further adaptations were promoted by supply of food on land and absence of predators, right? So this is why animals, it made sense for them to move from the aquatic environment to the land, okay? So anyway, there's this hypothesis out there, and for a while there wasn't really, I don't know, there was some evidence, but not any great evidence to support this. And so there was this transitional fossil that was found called Tiktaalik rosé, and basically it was an intermediate between lobed fishes and tetrapods with limbs, and obviously supported this hypothesis. Okay, so this is actually showing you this sort of transitional form, this example of that. Of that fossil that was formed versus an ancestral amphibian. And you can see the similarities here. And if you look at the bones that are present at the joints here, same bones, okay? Again, indicates that these guys have a similar evolutionary origin. All right, so if you talk about amphibians today, 3 main groups: salamanders and newts, frogs and toads, and the caecilians. Okay? And these guys are, I don't know, you probably never really thought of these, or maybe you've seen them and maybe you think it's a snake, but it's not. It's amphibian. So legless, sightless, and they're worm-shaped. All right. Right, so to show you some examples here. So here's a salamander, right? So again, salamander's an amphibian. It's not, right? It's not a lizard. It's not a reptile, okay? Moist, smooth skin, obviously a frog, a bullfrog, and this is that caecilian that I talked about before. All right, so that brings us to the next group, which is the reptiles. Okay, so more than about 17,000 species, including birds, right? So at one point, birds were not classified as reptiles. They have now been classified in the reptile group. Okay, so if I ask you if a bird is a reptile, the answer is yes, based on the current classification. Again, characteristics. We should know these characteristics. Paired limbs. Reptiles have thick, scaly skin, not smooth, mucousy, moist skin like amphibians, okay? It's impermeable to water. Efficient breathing, efficient circulation, efficient excretion. Again, they're ectothermic, cold-blooded, and they have well-adapted reproduction. Okay, so they have internal fertilization, right? The eggs fertilize internally, and they lay shelled amniotic eggs, right? So this, if you have an amniotic egg, you have an advantage because that amniotic fluid protects the developing embryo and nourishes it. So if you want to look at just some basic reptilian anatomy, again, not responsible for this, right? But you can see very well-developed organs and organ systems. This is obviously showing an example of a crocodile. All right, this part, honestly, you can just skip over this. This is, if you talk about evolution of amniotes, one of the sort of characteristics that they have used to kind of decipher the sort of ancestral lineage of these is the type of skull, and how many openings are in the skull. And so this is what where these terms come from: inapsid, diapsid, and synapsid, right? And so you can see that it's just sort of a trait that's separated out or kind of set some of these groups apart, okay? So again, I'm not going to ask you about synapsid, anapsid, or diapsid, or really anything about this here, okay? But again, if you know, it looks like, phylogenetic tree, just like we've seen before. It's just, again, pointing out these sort of different types of skull. Well, so this is, you know what, this is a little insert that's in your textbook. There's always a, sort of little story that's in your textbook that relates to the chapter. And so this was about vertebrates and human medicine and how they're used, right? So it's showing you there a poison dart frog, right? There are species of frogs and other species of animals that are vertebrates that you essentially can extract, something that they make and use it as a medicine, right? So this poison dart frog can be used as a medicine. Pigs is a source of organs. So you can use it for transplants. Okay. Oh my goodness. And then, so that's what this is showing you here, right? So you could have potentially a pig heart and transplant it into it. All right, if we talk about living reptiles now and the diversity, right, here are some different types that we probably all are familiar with. Turtles and tortoises, obviously reptiles. The ribs in the thoracic vertebrae are fused into that heavy shell. They lack teeth, but they have a sharp beak they can use to basically eat their prey. Lizards have 4-clawed feet. They're carnivorous. Snakes, we know about all these guys too. Some can be venomous. The tuataras actually have a third eye. And then crocodilians. Okay? And so here's some examples here. Some turtles. This is showing you a Gila monster here, a lizard, diamondback rattlesnake. Here's this tuatara, which again, it kind of looks like a lizard, but it has this eye over here that you can't really see. It's not visible. But so these guys are, it's a separate group here. And this is showing an American crocodile coming out of that amniotic or that shelled amniotic egg, right? So the reptile egg and having the presence of this amniotic egg is a characteristic that's unique to the reptiles, and we haven't seen this before, okay? We don't see this in the amphibians, we see it in the reptiles. All right, like I said, birds are within the reptile group, okay? There's lots and lots of evidence that shows that birds evolved from dinosaurs, okay? Again, characteristics. Feathers, okay? So the modified reptilian scale has feathers, okay? Modified skeleton, because they have to be able to fly, right? So they have this sort of modifications that allow that skeleton to be more light. Modified respiration, same thing. They're up in higher pressure areas. And so, and they have, if they're flying, they need a constant supply of oxygen. And so they have modified lungs. And we talk about this when we'll talk about respiratory system. Here's, one really main difference between reptiles and the birds, even though, well, not reptile, I shouldn't say it like that, but, right, that's the thing. I mean, we're classifying these as reptiles, but we're saying that these are ectothermic. Well, birds are actually endothermic. Okay, so again, you kind of can see how these guys are kind of hard to classify. They don't share all the same characteristics as reptiles. Okay, so one thing that's unique between birds and the other reptiles, right, is that they're endothermic, meaning they're warm-blooded. They have the ability to regulate their internal body temperature. Okay, they have well-developed sense organs in the nervous system, right? Acute vision, instinctual behavior like songs, right? That they can, they can pretty much automatically recognize the song, that's particular to their species. All right, so this is showing you again some bird anatomy. Nobody needs to memorize or be able to identify the anatomy here. And also showing you kind of some of these modifications of the skeleton to allow them to fly, okay? All right, so if we talk about birds and sort of diversity, again, we're probably all aware of these, right? Most can fly, right? Eagles, geese, mockingbirds, all can fly, although geese, you don't see them fly much, they can. Some actually are flightless, so birds like emus, penguins, ostriches, they can't fly, actually, okay? And so obviously some examples here, okay? All right, the last group that we're going to talk about are the mammals. Obviously, this is the group that we are members of in terms of general characteristics of mammals. Again, you're responsible for this. Here, what the name mammals comes from the presence of mammary glands, right? All mammals have milk-producing mammary glands. The skeleton some sort of unique characteristics of the skeleton. Mammalian skull accommodates a larger brain relative to the body size, and they have differentiated teeth and internal organs that are super efficient and well developed. Okay, and most mammals have internal development. Okay, where up until now we're talking about external, development. All right, and so if we talk about evolution of mammals, right? The first true mammals believed to appear during the Triassic period, and it was believed that mammals coexisted with dinosaurs. Okay. The earliest type or earliest mammalian group is a group called monotremes, which are actually egg-laying mammals. And then you had placental mammals that really flourished, right, when the dinosaurs became extinct, right? So we talked about that term adaptive radiation before, right? When one species goes away and the other one's basically able to kind of infiltrate their habitat and be able to flourish. So this is basically sort of showing some of the things that we just mentioned here. You can look at the timeline, right? And you can look at kind of where this first, mammal or common ancestor essentially of the mammal appeared here, right? And so you can see now there's these three branches of mammals. So there's monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals. Okay, so if you talk about monotremes, again, they're mammals that lay eggs, amniotic eggs, marsupials. These guys, some development happens inside, but it's necessary to have that very, very young, underdeveloped fetus essentially has to maintain in the pouch. So the entire developmental process does not happen internally. Okay. Placental mammals, everything, the entire developmental process happens inside the animal, right? And you have a placenta that is used for exchange between, hence the name placental mammals, right? Used for exchange between maternal and fetal blood. And again, allows for full development of that animal. And so we can show you some examples here. So duck-billed platypus is a monotreme, right? Lays eggs. Koala, marsupial, right? Another marsupial here as well. All right, and so if this is basically showing you all the different orders, right, of placental mammals. Okay, so you can take a look here of all these different types of mammals that exist. And that's the end of our vertebrate lecture.